Good afternoon. Happy Saturday, folks, and welcome to Scientist Saturdays here with the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. I'm not at the museum right now. I'm still at home, and I love being at the museum so much I swiped a piece of it to hang on my wall. My name is Lee, and I'm in charge of video conferencing content and programs at the museum. And today I have a distinct pleasure of interviewing someone that I've never interviewed before. It's amazing. After being at the museum for 13 years, I thought I had talked to everyone. But today I get to talk to the Senior Collections Manager of Paleobotany and Paleoecology, Michael Donovan. Michael, are you out there somewhere? Oh,
Hey, Lee.
Good morning. How are you doing this fine Saturday? Everything okay on your end?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
It's a beautiful day, man. It's a beautiful day. And anybody who's tuning in on Facebook, we appreciate you coming inside, or maybe you're standing outside looking at your phone. However you're joining us, we appreciate you hanging out with us. If you're rewatching the recorded interview, hey, we appreciate that too. And folks, during my talk with Mr. Donovan, if you want to type in chat questions, that would be fantastic. I have some planned questions of my own. And the social media tech crew, we got Matt hanging out in the background, show director Matt, and also Samantha Gunther helping us out. They'll be sending me your chat questions. So if you do have them, shoot them on over here and we will relay them. While we are doing this interview, obviously there'll be like teeny tiny delays in between since it's the internet. So don't panic if we don't spot your question the instant that you type it. Now, Mr. Donovan, I had practiced your title many a time. Do you mind if I call you Michael during this interview? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Fantastic. And we're going to hear about coal. Specifically, I don't want to like break the word too early, but it's a specific kind of phenomenon, an object that you find in coal. And when I teach little kids about coal, they always tell me, "Oh, coal is made of dead dinosaurs." So even before we discuss you and your job, could you just clarify, is coal made of dead dinosaurs?
Yeah, so dinosaurs are pretty cool. They're obviously really popular fossils, but they're not responsible for everything. So coal is actually made of ancient plant material, um, plants that were growing in a wet environment and formed a material called peat, which was decaying plant matter that got covered up by little pieces of sediment, so little pieces of mud and sand, and was compressed over millions of years, eventually becoming coal that we can use for energy today.
Well, that makes perfect sense then, since your title is botany, that's plants. And now we can clarify for all the kids out there, coal is made of lots and lots of very dead and old plants. And could you also
Yep.
clarify the difference between paleobotany and paleoecology?
Yeah, so paleobotany is the study of ancient plants. So we can study the ancient plants to learn about what they looked like, what they did in their environment, how they interacted with each other, how they reacted to changes in the environment, like climate change or mass extinctions. Um, Paleoecology is the study of the interactions between ancient life forms, between each other and between their environment. Um, so you can be both a paleobotanist and a paleoecologist. You could also be a paleoecologist and not a paleobotanist. For example, if you study the ecology of ancient marine organisms, how they interacted with their environment, like how they were affected by water depth, for example.
That makes sense because I've spoken to other researchers and curators at the museum who say they are a paleoecologist, but then there's another field of study they specialize in, like paleomammalogy, that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
what specifically can we learn? I mean, coal, I think most people think of coal as a fossil fuel, right? Ooh, and there's that word fossil. Check it out. See, the kids weren't totally wrong. Fossil fuel. So it's an energy source, but could you allude before we watch the video to what are some of the things you can learn from coal itself or the fossil plants in coal?
Yeah, so because the coal is formed by the matter of ancient plants, there's often plant fossils associated with the coal. Um, so some of these are complex plant parts. So you can see like the leaves or stems of the plants, um, and figure out what type of plants were growing in an environment when the coal, or before or after the coal was being formed. You can use that to reconstruct the ancient ecosystems. There's also something called coal balls, which can be found in coal seams. Coal balls actually preserve the anatomy of the plant. So you can see some of the microscopic details of the plant, like the cells.
Wow, because when I think about coal, I just think about a big black rock. But if it's able to preserve plant details, that's pretty amazing. And let's clarify too, right before we throw the video up there, there's a chunk of time that I teach about called the Carboniferous period. Could you explain why we use that word?
Yeah, so the Carboniferous period is the time period where a lot of coal was formed. So coal is high in carbon, so the name Carboniferous is based on that. The Carboniferous is split up into two sub-periods called the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. Today, we're going to be talking about the Pennsylvanian mostly, which was about 323 to 299 million years ago. And this is when a lot of the coal that's used today was formed. It's named after the state of Pennsylvania, where a lot of these rocks from this time period were formed.
We don't you have I think we've created some slides to give our audience like a visual of what things. Yeah, that. Look at those crazy plants, man. Those are nothing like plants today. Or are some of those plants still alive today, Michael?
Yeah, so these some of these plants have living relatives. Some of them also have gone completely extinct and haven't left any living relatives. So yeah, this is kind of a reconstruction of what one of these forests might have looked like during this coal period where the coal was being formed.
And Pennsylvanian, that's referring to a specific piece of time within the Carboniferous. I think we have a graphic to kind of, I have a hard time, yeah, that one. I have a hard time grasping these giant time scales. So if you could point out where are we actually looking during this video?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at the slice in this, the geologic timescale here. So the older times are at the bottom of the timescale. And as you go up, you get more recent. So the time that we're going to be talking about is the Pennsylvanian, which is about 323 to 299 million years ago.
Oh, and I can see from that graphic, look, kids, see where all those dinosaur skulls were? They were later in time. Yep, there it is. They're above where it says gigantic extinction, and there's some pretty obvious plant fossils in there. I love that graphic. Ray Troll, he's an awesome artist. Well, thank you for that clarification. Now we know we're going way back into time, around 322 million years ago. Let's go ahead and run that video so we can see a little snippet of the type of fossils that we're discussing today.
Hi, and welcome to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History's Specimen Spotlight. I'm your host, Lee Hall, and today some very interesting things are sprouting up in the Department of Paleobotany and Paleoecology. Today we're here with Dr. Denise Su, who is the curator of Paleobotany and Paleoecology. Hi, Denise.
Hi, Lee.
Thanks for having us today.
You're welcome. Glad to have you guys here.
So this is really cool. You have some very interesting objects here before us. These specimens are really, they look so different, but they're related.
Yes, they are.
Will you please take us through what exactly this is here?
So this is a coal ball. You might be wondering why it's held together by rubber bands.
Yes.
So we actually found this coal ball not too long ago in the back of a cabinet. It was in, I don't know, about maybe 15, 20 pieces. And one of our volunteers put it back together, and to hold it together, she put rubber bands around it for now. Now, it's not made out of coal. It's found in coal seams. And it's dated to the Pennsylvanian, so what, 300 to 325 million years ago. And these are just pockets of the coal seam where the vegetation did not compress into coal. So this is
really,
yep. So this is from those pockets, and so there's actually, it doesn't look like much, as you can see. It kind of looks like just kind of a rock.
Yeah, it's heavy too.
It is
really
heavy.
Dense.
It's filled with vegetation. Now, coal balls are actually very fragile, and they tend to fall apart very quickly, as is the case with this one. And once they start falling apart, there's really not much you can do about it. But maybe about 25, 30 years ago, the previous curator of this collection Chitili, she actually encased them in wax.
This is wax.
This is wax. So she encased them in wax.
Okay. So there's a coal ball.
There's a coal ball in
this
here.
wax.
In this
like
wax,
this
and
one.
exactly. And so this wax actually has protected these coal balls. They kept the shape, so it didn't disintegrate like this one. Now we could take the rubber bands off, and you can see what a disintegrated coal ball looks
Not
like.
Not gonna do that.
Because you have
I
to
know
put it
better.
back together.
Exactly.
But this wax jacket really just kept these coal balls pristine. They didn't degrade. I know of coal balls in other collections where they didn't do this process, and their coal balls basically look like this.
And the information you're seeking isn't necessarily on the outside
No.
of the mass.
No, it's actually all inside, and you can see here, this is actually a cut coal ball. So, so it's been sectioned, and this is what this one looks like on the inside.
How do you cut them?
Just with a rock saw.
You cut these, so you cut them with a saw.
Yep. We melt the wax off first, and then we cut it with a saw. Yep.
Really?
And then so you have the surface, and what you do then, you see this piece of acetate on here. You put acetate on top, and you etch it with acid, and then you peel the acetate off. And when you do that, a single layer, cell layer basically, of the coal ball is adhered to the acetate, and this is what you end up with. This really thin peel. We call them peels. We're very imaginative. Yes.
That is fantastic.
And
so what are we looking at here? All these circular structures.
yeah, so this is the aerial roots of a plant called Soronius from the Pennsylvanian. It's basically a giant fern tree. They can get up to about 100 feet.
Wow.
Yeah. And these are not trees in the sense that we think of trees. They're not wood. This is the roots that they put down. These aerial roots are actually the structure of the tree. And so this is, in this particular case, this peel, this coal ball only had the Soronius roots, but we have other peels where you might have 3 or 4 different types of plants in there as well.
So different coal balls will contain different parts of the anatomy of a plant.
Yep, that's right. And different species of plants too. And it is really, really neat. You go from this that looks like nothing, but then when you actually look inside it, then you have so much information about what the environment was like in that particular area in the Pennsylvanian.
It's unbelievable that you would be able to get microscopic details of plant anatomy out of a lump of rock from a coal seam.
Yeah.
But that's why science is awesome, I guess.
It is awesome.
That's why paleobotany and paleoecology are awesome.
That is true. I totally agree.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us today, and we will see you next time on Specimen Spotlight.
Now all of our audience is thinking, do they only hire people named Lee to do these interviews? Yes, we do. Michael, coal ball, I had never heard of such a phenomenon until basically now working at the museum. And they kind of remind me of a geode, this magical little round thing full of treasures, right? So I know Dr. Sue described the basics of how they form, but she did not mention where those particular specimens came from. Do you know where they came from?
Yeah, so the one in the rubber band is from, we're not actually sure where it's from. So just a little tip for the audience, if you ever collect a fossil, make sure you document where you found it, because the rocks where the fossil was found tell the story of the environment that the fossil formed in. So we're going to learn about where the plant might have been growing based on the rocks. The second one, the actual peel, is from Steubenville, Ohio. So it's found sort of local to Cleveland in a coal seam in Steubenville.
Steubenville, cool. It's a local coal ball. That's awesome. And when you slice the coal balls open, she was showing that cool peel off of there. Are you actually looking at ancient plant material that's unchanged from 322-ish million years ago?
So you actually are able to see the cellular structures under a microscope. How coal balls are formed is not completely understood. Sort of the classical explanation is that these plants were part of this peat, and while they're being compressed, there's some seawater carrying minerals that moved through the plant matter and sort of replaced the structure of the cells of the plant. So the minerals hardened and actually preserved the shape of the cells. But the actual why it happened in certain areas and not others is not well understood.
Well, that's kind of cool anyway, because it's fun to be able to say we don't know everything in science. Sometimes there are still some mysteries out there. We had a question come in from Adam, and he's asking about the coal balls. Did they form from the coal or vice versa? I think I see what he's getting at, because he's thinking, well, if the coal's made of plants, the coal ball is the plants. How would you answer that question? That's a sneaky one.
Yeah, so the coal balls and the coal formed from the same source material, so it's both formed from the peat. But for whatever reason, the material in the coal ball wasn't compressed down. It still maintains the original structure of the plant. You can actually make a bunch of these peels and follow the structure through. So for example, if there's a stem within a coal ball, you can make lots of peels and see how the stem changes. If you're looking at the coal, it's been super compressed and you don't really see that level of detail. It's hard to make out what originally was making the plant. It's more microscopic, what's left over, just little bits.
Gotcha. And it's not our scientists, because part 2 of Adam's question was, how do you find those, or how do you find the natural coal? It's not like our scientists are going out there looking for coal, right? Or is this like an accidental, oh, somebody is digging in a coal mine and they're like, oh, there's a coal ball. How does that happen?
Yeah, so a lot of times historically, people like paleobotanists have worked with mining companies to actually go into mines and collect directly from the mines. In other cases, the coal seams are exposed on a rock outcrop, and like maybe there's a river or something that's exposed to coal. So you can actually just find it in that way. You don't have to go into a mine. So it kind of depends. Like a lot of the work has been done with mines, in collaboration with mines.
That's really cool, though, because then you have scientists looking for ancient evidence of different kinds of life, working in conjunction with, say, construction projects or mining operations. The whole I-71 project, creating that freeway, brought us so many Devonian fossils. That's a neat thing to point out, that it's a team effort to sometimes unearth these amazing objects. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do is get back to that one with the wax, because that's a fascinating thing to me, thinking about preserving an ancient item in wax. And you had some images to show us a little more clear. What's going on with this picture?
Yeah, so the reason that they've been preserved in wax is to protect against something called Pyrite Disease. That is something that can happen when there's a reaction between pyrite and humidity in the atmosphere. And when this reaction occurs, it can degrade the fossil, cause it to break up, and a lot of the details are lost. So in order to protect it, one of the past curators, Shai Chidley, encased the coal balls in wax to try to protect it from these changes in humidity, and hopefully prevent the spread of pyrite disease.
Pyrite disease. That's fascinating to me, because one of the minerals kids love very much in our rocks and minerals programs is pyrite, fool's gold, right? And now we can tell them, yeah, but it's not okay, man, because that stuff messes up our coal balls. Now, there was one picture in that video of this amazing giant tree, and I forgot what its name is. Oh no, it started with a PS with a silent P. Can you get into a little more of like what were all those plants back in the Pennsylvanian period?
Yeah, so the plant in the video is called Ceronius, which was a fern that could grow about 30 feet tall. And what was interesting about it was its root structure. Typically, if you look at trees outside, most of the trees, the roots are just at the base of the tree and they go into the ground. With Ceronius, the roots actually started high up in the stem and then traveled down to the ground and into the ground. And the reason for this is that, unlike, say, a maple tree, which can grow outward, it can get wider as it grows up, ferns don't really increase in width on their stems. So it used these roots to kind of provide a base and a structure for it to grow 30 feet tall.
A 30-foot tall fern just kind of blows my mind right there. I don't know if I can even visualize it, but that's okay, because you figured out some pictures, didn't you? To take us on a little tour through a Pennsylvanian forest. Let's take a look at some of those, shall we?
So this picture here is what you see when you look at a coal ball. You can see the left one, or when you look at a coal ball peel. So this left one is one of the peels. The right is sort of a drawing of the peel, and it shows a bunch of different plant parts just labeled. So this is kind of what you have to do when you're studying it. You have to pick out all these little details and figure out what's going on in the coal ball. And you're able to learn about the structure of the plant, or you can learn about more the ecology of the environment if you quantify the diversity of different types of plants in the coal balls. So this slide here is about lycopsids. During the earlier part of the Pennsylvanian, lycopsids were one of the most dominant types of plants in the environment. So in wetland environments. So you can see a drawing of one of these lycopsids on the top left part. The picture to the right of that with the green background, this is the outer part of a trunk of one of these trees. So it has this sort of scaly pattern. Yeah. So that scale pattern, they're called scalp trees. But a lot of times when I show these to people, they think it might be like a snake skin or something because it has this sort of diamond pattern. But what it actually is are leaf bases. So when this tree was growing, there were little leaves that extended out of these marks that fell off. So now you just get the little triangle leaf bases preserved. We also have, to the right of that, this is what another coal ball would look like. So you're actually looking at the inside of the plant. So if you took a tree and you cut it down and we're able to see the inside, that's what you're looking here with a branch. So you can see all the different tissues that you use for support or for transferring fluids into the plant. To the right of that is a cone, which actually produced spores. So the trees are kind of weird in that they didn't really have branches up the trunk. So they were about 100 feet tall, and the branches were really only at the top part. And there the branches were, and the leaves were, and also these cones that produce spores to reproduce. And you can see some of the leaves
That's kind of what I was visualizing.
on the bottom part.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm thinking about that crazy picture. Oh, I shouldn't say crazy, but it looks kind of crazy to me because I'm not familiar with these plants. This is what you study. But the one over on the top left, it's extraordinary because you have roots at the bottom, big, tall, massive trunk, and then canopy. And that reminds me of like today's rainforest trees because they're competing for light in those middle areas. So what was the climate like during the Pennsylvanian for these giant ferns to grow?
Yeah, so these plants that I'm showing now were growing in wetland environments. So it was pretty warm and wet at this time. It's a little weird in that, like with the rainforest, these trees are competing for light. So they get taller to kind of get more light, so they're not being shaded by each other. In this case, the canopy was actually pretty open at this time, based on studies that have been done on fossil forests from the Pennsylvanian, where you can actually map out where different types of trees were located. They weren't actually that densely placed, at least the really tall trees. So it doesn't seem to be an issue of not being able to get light in this case. A weird thing about the lycopsid trees is that the stems were likely photosynthetic, so they were probably green and able to produce nutrients for the plant, even on the stem.
Wow. Are there modern day equivalents of these giant Pennsylvanian plants?
Yeah, so for the lycopsids, there are two living groups that are related, the club mosses and the quillworts. So these are not as large as the 100-foot tall trees that existed in the Pennsylvanian. They're a lot smaller, but you can find some of these locally in the local metro parks. There's definitely little club mosses that can be found. But yeah, not the huge ones, unfortunately.
My grandmother used to have a little stand of these she called them horsetails, and they just look like green, sort of like straws sticking up out of the ground. And she said they didn't make flowers, but they kind of crept underground and then sent up other little tendrils. Are those modern day equivalents of I keep saying Pennsylvania, but then it makes it sound like modern Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvanian era? Is that the right way to say it?
Yes. Yeah, okay. There are horsetails from the Pennsylvanian.
Excellent.
Then also, like the lycopsids, they were pretty big in some cases. So yeah, there's a reconstruction there on the left part, and you can see what you're describing with the roots going horizontal underground. They had a similar growth structure like that, where the roots were kind of horizontal and the stems were coming off of that. One thing you might notice is the things that are called nodes. So there's little lines on the stem that segment the stem. And this is where leaves or roots came out in a whorl pattern. So they were coming out sort of in a circle around the stem. So that's a really distinctive feature from these. And you can see that really well in the picture of the leaves called annularia on the bottom left part of this slide. They all kind of came out of the stem in a circle pattern.
I remember those nodes from the plants. They look like tiny bamboo to me. Is that do you call them nodes on bamboo plants too?
Good question. I think.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Oh, I stumped the expert. That's exciting. Okay, well, we'll look that up later because Craig sent in a question. Craig was asking about the previous slide, the one with the green background that I was joking that looked like a waffle. He was asking, was that found in a coal ball or was it a rock fossil type?
Oh, yeah, so that's a good point. So there's two different types of fossils that I'm showing. The coal balls are the ones where you see a lot of little detail, little cellular detail. But the other types are the compression fossils, like the one with the green background, the lepidodendron. So that's something that the plant part was covered in sediment and compressed down. And in that case, there's no anatomical detail. You can't, if you cut that open, you wouldn't see any cells or anything like that.
Gotcha. We're making show director Matt work hard jumping around in the pictures there. But we had one more example of a modern day equivalent, right? I think it was the seed ferns slide. I think we missed that one.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see if Matt can find it. He's hating me in the background right now. He's like, wait, stop. See, this is why everybody who does interviews with me are like, you're so hard on Matt. I'm like, I know. So while Matt finds that picture, oh, he caught me up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so those are seed ferns. So these are actually not related to modern ferns. So modern ferns are they reproduce by spores, and these actually created seeds. But this was a common type of plant during the Pennsylvanian. If you look at the picture on the upper right part, that is from a coal ball, and that's actually showing a cross section of the seed. So that's like if you took the seed and cut it open, you can see all the internal anatomy. The little part PC is the pollen chamber, where the pollen actually entered the seed during reproduction. There's also roots on the bottom left. You can see all the cellular details. So those little holes are part of the xylem, which is tissue that transferred water up into the upper parts of the plant. And then finally, you have Neuropteris ovata, which is a common type of foliage that was associated with these seed fern plants. Sort of a weird aspect of naming plants from this time is that when you're looking at fossil plants, if you think of if you look at a tree, everything's attached. Like you have the trunk and you have the bark and the roots and the leaves. You can all see it together. But with fossils, a lot of the time they got broken up. So you'll find leaves separated from the trunk, separated from the reproductive parts. So then you have to figure out how those actually go together. So initially, a lot of times people will name individual plant parts. So like the leaves will have a name and the trunk will have a different name. And then over time, either they'll be found attached to each other or there'll be some clues that make it clear that those two things were actually part of the same plant.
Wow. Well, that happens with other life forms too. Like you find a dinosaur body, but no head. And then somebody finds the head and they get renamed. Man, it's a puzzle all the time. And that kind of leads into the next question that I had from Adam. He was asking about you working with geologists. Does that happen often in your career?
Yeah, there's a lot of collaboration between geologists and paleontologists. As a paleontologist, you have to know some geology to be able to interpret the rocks where they're found. But the geologists, that's what they focus on. People who do sedimentology, they can really read the rocks, figure out what the environments that the rocks were formed in really well. So it's great to collaborate with people like that. Also, geologists can do dating of the rocks in some cases, help figure out how old the actual fossils you're looking at were.
I like that. Collaboration is the name of the game right there. Perfect. Now, wait a minute.
Yeah.
As you were talking about all these amazing tropical plants, I'm thinking, but you said that cobalt came from Ohio. So what's going on with that? Where in the world was Ohio when all these plants and coal-forming plants were actually growing?
Yeah, so Ohio at this point was a lot closer to the equator. So during the Pennsylvanian, the Appalachian Mountains were kind of hugged the equator. They were sort of in a line parallel to the equator. And the Ohio would have been in that general region. So if you look at that map, you can see there's an arrow that says Ancestral Rockies on the left side. If you go to the right of that a little with the Appalachian Mountains, there's actually, it's a little difficult to see, but there's actually an outline of the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes weren't around then, but the general location is marked on the map. So it was a lot different location on the Earth back then than where we're located now.
And that means because we're talking about millions and millions of years of a span, there was climate change going on because all those land masses were in motion, right? Let's talk a little bit about that. Is how did those plants adapt to that changing climate?
Yeah, so actually I have a quick thing to show. There's a delivery. Here's a cobalt peel. You can see how thin it is. So I actually made this when I was in college, and it was at my mom's house. And I asked her if she could mail it, and it just came now. My girlfriend slipped it under my door.
No way! Yay for Michael's mom!
So you can see what it actually looks like in real life. The process is pretty cool. You got to cut the cobalt open. You got to smooth it, grind it down, put some acid on it, and then put this little thin layer of plastic on top, and then peel it off, and you get this little layer. So that's what a cobalt looks like. So thanks, Mom, for sending that. It came just in time. So yeah, the climate during the Pennsylvanian is, it changed a lot during that time. So there's periods of glacial and interglacial periods. So these cycles took about 100,000 years where they would transition. So during these, sometimes it was much more warm and wet, and that's where the plants that we were looking at came from during this really warm, wet period. So if you look at the left side of this slide here, there's two different environments in the wetland environments. So the top one is from the middle Pennsylvanian, and this has a lot of these like Hopsid trees. They're the really tall trees that reproduce with spores. And you can see that the canopy isn't very dense. There's a lot of open space. But by the late Pennsylvanian, there was a major change, probably related to changes in carbon dioxide levels. And that has a much more dense canopy, and the big Lycopsid trees weren't really as common. They sort of reduced in numbers greatly. But during the other time, when it wasn't this wetland environment, there were dryland environments where there wasn't as much rainfall, and these had different plants. So in the upper right part, that's an environment dominated by something called cordytes. So these are a seed plant that was pretty common during these drier periods. And then the picture below it shows the actual conifers called Walkia. So these were pretty common in these drier environments. So you had a lot of change between these wetland and dryland environments. As the climate changed, the wetland environments would spread out. They would be more widespread because the climate would be good for them. As the climate would change again, and then the dryland environments would take over, and the wetland environments would survive in smaller patches called refugia that had the right conditions for them to survive.
I think that's my new favorite word. You had mentioned that while we were doing our dry run for this interview, the refugia. I'm like, that's the coolest word because we're kind of all existing in our own little refugias right now while we're in quarantine times. Exactly. Now, if the plants are changing, that means the animals that eat the plants also have to adapt or not survive. And that's your specific field of research. And I want to get to that for the last chunk of our interview. So let's take a look at what you are actively researching with these ancient plants.
Yeah. So there's lots of animals that lived in these environments during the Pennsylvanian. So there's vertebrates. There's something called Fedexia, which was an amphibian. It was found on FedEx's land near Pittsburgh, so it's named after that. There was one of the earliest reptile called Hylonomus was also from the Pennsylvanian. But a lot of the animals that you would have seen if you just were walking around in the Pennsylvanian, similar today, were insects and other arthropods. So arthropods are things that are segmented, they have jointed appendages, they have an exoskeleton. This includes things like insects and arachnids, like spiders, crustaceans. So this picture here is an insect called Meganeura, which was a really large insect during the Pennsylvanian. This is found in France, and its wingspan is about 26 inches wide. So there's a lot of really big insects during the time. Not all of them were big, but some of them were. And some of these insects were interacting with the plants and feeding on plants. So there's lots of different types of feeding that insects can do. Like if you go outside today, you don't have to go back into the Carboniferous. You can just walk outside and look at a bush or look at a tree and see what insects are doing. And you can see lots of different types of feeding damage. In the Carboniferous, a lot of these types of feeding damage existed, even though this is 300 million years ago. So here's a slide showing some pictures of insect damage on ancient plants. So the picture on the left, the artwork is of a Ceronius tree. That's the giant fern. So there was a lot of different organisms that were feeding on the fern. So if you look at the top middle picture, you see that dark line. So this is actually part of a coal ball. So the coal balls can teach you about the plants. They can also teach you about the insects that were feeding on the plants. So that dark line is actually the position where an insect's mouth entered. So this is a group of insects called Paleodictyoptera that lived at this time, and they had a sucking mouth part. So it was like a straw that would enter that they would insert into the plant and suck out fluids. So you can see the black line, that's actually damaged tissue. So if you think of, like, if you get a cut, the scar tissue or a scab will develop to protect yourself from bacteria and viruses entering the cut. The plant does a similar thing where it creates reaction tissue that acts as a scar to heal itself and keep bad things from entering. There's also below that, you can see little dots, little black dots in sort of circular regions. So those are tunnels from mites. And the little dots are called coprolites, which is another word for feces. So you can actually see the evidence of what happened after the mites were feeding on the plant. They leave these little tunnels with their little fecal pellets all over the place.
Darn insects pooping all over the place. I think I've heard another term for insect feces is frass. Is that the right word?
Yeah. So frass is a common word used for insect feces. That's usually what I call it. But you can see frass all over the place in fossil plants and modern plants because the insects are really abundant. Like insects and plants are the most diverse multicellular organisms in the world. And today about 70% of insects feed on plants. So there's lots of these interactions, but they extend way back into the past, and we can learn about how the insects and the plants adapted to things like climate change, for example, which is another project I'm working on. So I'm working on a plant called Macroneuropterus scheutzeri. So this is kind of a weird plant. It has these little, if you look at the picture on the right side, if you see those little lines on the plant, they're little like hair-like structures that are on the leaves. So if you could call a Pennsylvanian plant charismatic, I would say Macroneuropterus is the charismatic one with its little hairs. The reason for the hairs is kind of controversial. Some people think they were transferring resin. Some people then maybe like protecting it from things eating it. But yeah, the reason for them is not super well understood. But I've been looking at trying to see how insect feeding on these plants change because of climate change. So changing because of these interglacial cycles as the plants shifted from wetland habitats, and then the dryland habitats moved in, and then wetland again, and seeing how this changed over time. So the next picture on the next slide I had is showing a lot of different types of feeding on the plant. So if you look at where the arrows are pointing on the picture on the left two, those are showing where an insect chewed through the leaf. So like 300 million years ago, there's an insect that was on one leaf and it chewed, and then this one leaf was fossilized, and 300 million years ago, I'm looking at it and documenting and seeing how it changed quantitatively over this period in the Pennsylvanian. So this might have been made by something like an ancestor of grasshoppers or ancestor of cockroaches. It's hard to say exactly what was making it, but we do know that they were feeding on these plants at this time.
That is amazing. It's just this little tiny snapshot of action, like something happening. It's not just a dead animal or a dead plant. It's something that was actually happening at that time. That's neat.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. We're actually able to document the behaviors really well because, yeah, a lot of the time you see what the animal looks like or you see what the plant looks like, but here we're able to kind of put two different organisms together, how they're working together, or I guess working against each other in this case. But yeah, you can see things like the chewing marks. There's little chewing along the margins of leaves. There can be holes in the leaf. Sometimes something called oviposition, which is not a type of feeding, that's actually laying eggs on the plant. So that was the picture I had on the last slide on the right side. It actually shows little areas where a female insect inserted what's called an ovipositor, which is a structure it has that actually lays the egg. So it inserted the eggs into the leaf where, they might have grown up, but in this case, they must have fallen in water and got fossilized, unfortunately. So those babies probably didn't see the light of day until now.
Unfortunate for them, fortunate for paleoecologists like yourself.
Yeah.
Man, we've given our viewing public all kinds of new fun words. We've got the coprolites out there, fossilized poo. We've got frass. We've got refugia, and I think that's caused some of our viewers to start thinking about the origins of names, because we have a non sequitur question here. Why are these periods called Mississippian and Pennsylvanian?
In the case, so oftentimes geologic time periods are named after the location where they've been well studied or where representative rocks are located. So for example, Pennsylvanian rocks of that time period are found in all over the state of Pennsylvania. If you think of like where coal mining has happened, those are places where Pennsylvanian rocks usually are. So yeah, that was named because of the location of where the rocks actually are. Obviously, at the time, there were rocks. The Pennsylvanian existed. It's a time period. So everywhere on Earth at the time was part of the Pennsylvanian, but rocks aren't preserved everywhere. So you got to go to where they're actually preserved.
Makes sense to me. And speaking of going where things are happening, if our viewers are going to be scattering out and enjoying this nice day in between all the rain, they could go look for evidence of arthropod herbivory in present times, couldn't they?
Yeah. I think that, so insects and plants are super common. Like if you go outside, what living things do you usually see? Insects and plants are the most obvious, also birds. So if you learn something about insects and plants, you're always going to have something interesting to look at wherever you go, because they're everywhere. But yeah, during the Pennsylvanian, the diversity of insect feeding was lower than what we have today. That was a long time ago. The different types were still evolving and getting more diverse. So if you go out today, you'll be able to see things that weren't even occurring 300 million years ago. You can see all sorts of different types of chewing damage. You can see something called galling, which started in the Pennsylvanian actually, or possibly even earlier than that. But that's a type of damage where insect larvae, an insect egg is laid into a plant and it causes a chemical reaction with the plant, which causes the growth of tissue. And the insect larva will actually grow in this little tissue growth. So you can see things like that. Leaf mines, where an insect courses through the leaf, leaving a little trail that's visible. Also frass. If you want to look for frass, look out for leaf mines, these little trails. You can see little pellets of frass. So yeah, if you learn about insects and plants, you always have something interesting to see outside.
My favorite part of that entire explanation is that the last thing you said was, and don't forget to look for the poo. That's great. I love it. Man, well, we have kept you and all of our viewers indoors on this lovely day for, I think, plenty of time, and we really appreciate your time because I know you'd probably rather be doing research right now. So we're going to let you escape, Mr. Donovan. But thank you so much for hanging out with us today and talking about coal balls and all kinds of fascinating insect and plant interactions in the past. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
And you folks who are watching, don't forget that we've got lots more going on. This was part of our series CMNH at Home. If you go to our website and take a look, you will see lots and lots of things going on, and also new nighttime activities as well, CMNH at night. Thanks for joining us. My name's Lee again. Thank you so much for hanging out, and get out there and look for frass, folks.